Hello, I'm Horace Douty, and I'm near Lexington, Virginia, doing a Lexington history lesson, which is a new series featured on Horace Douty YouTube. And I encourage you to subscribe to Horace Douty YouTube, and you will get a number of nature lessons, sermons, prayers, and now history lessons. This lesson is called Life in These Back Parts of Virginia. In contrast to the history of Jamestown, Virginia, there is no record of mass starvation among the pioneers of Virginia's back parts, where we are right now. More than 100 years had passed since Jamestown. A government and commercial networks had been established, and agricultural practices were much improved. However, there are additional reasons for that contrast between want and plenty. Those first settlers of Jamestown had been more conscious of class. Gentlemen were not expected to do manual work. Ships from London would supply food whenever it could not be purchased from the natives. British sponsors would take care of the colony. Settlers would soon find gold to refill the empty ships for the return trip, they thought. And by the time frontiersmen had moved here into western Virginia, the dreams of gold had faded long since. Those Scot-Irish immigrants came in quest of land and economic opportunity. Their mindset was totally different. Class lines were blurred. Every able-bodied was expected to work. Upward social mobility had to be earned, not inherited. The people came into Rockbridge with remarkable courage and pitifully few possessions. Some could afford pack horses, some could only carry their needs on their back. Rifle and axe were the two major tools, along with some iron cooking pots. Everything else had to come from the materials at hand. Crucial questions arose at every step. Which plants can we eat? Which are deadly? How severe are the winters? Sparkling streams and water are everywhere, but is it safe to drink? Where are the Indians who created all this open land? Did they die of some mysterious disease? One of the most difficult questions was, where do we stop? Is there a better spot farther on, over the next ridge, or should we stay close to our neighbors? In 1737, the first Borden Grant settlers wasted no time. The McDowells and the Houstons made their choices and put down roots. They built log cabins near the great path and began building a heritage of self-defense. Other settlers followed. Many of them were less decisive. They lived in crude log shelters until they could be more certain of the right location. Cooking fires remained outdoors, Indian style. With time, the pioneers brought the fire inside, using chimneys made of mud and sticks called wattle and daub. Later, more prominent homes were eventually made of logs, stone. This is a more prominent log home behind me. And bricks, and safer chimneys were made of stone or brick. Wildlife, plentiful, provided most of the food. Indian corn and wheat and rye and oats were planted from the very beginning, along with flax and fruit trees. Sugar maples, wild sugar maples, produced abundant sweets long before honeybees were here. Wild chestnuts and native fruits comprise a large portion of the pioneer diet. Domestic farm animals were initially scarce, but very quickly large numbers of cattle and hogs roamed the countryside. Hemp, which could be turned into rope and cloth, was the cash crop. Flax was turned into linen. The process for both was labor-intensive. Outer clothing was usually fashioned from animal skins, deer or cowhide. Wool could be processed into a valuable fabric, but there was a problem. Sheep loved this Rockbridge environment, but wolves loved sheep more. And despite the legendary aversion to taxation, our ancestors in these back parts imposed the first tax it was for a bounty on wolf heads. With axe and adze and auger, the pioneer constructed his dwelling and his furnishings. When sickness or injury occurred, home remedies were concocted from field and forest. Serious wounds were sewn shut, both by the victim himself or by his helpers. Almost every permanent home site had a burial plot. Where I'm standing now has its own burial plot just a few hundred yards away. Death was familiar. The meeting house graveyard came as a later custom. Now, those Scot-Irish settlers did not require entertainment. Their primary social activity was the meeting, a Presbyterian worship service held wherever a preacher was available. And during the first quarter century, those gatherings were possible only once a month or less, because wilderness living did not diminish the educational requirements for clergy, and as a result, there were few ministers. In the late 1750s, Rockbridge settlers, still a part of Augusta, were caught up in a panic after the fresh defeated British troops at Fort Duquesne. Everybody expected France to help the Indians wipe out the entire American frontier, which was then actually British territory. And the British established a line of official military forts along the western frontier. And within communities here in the valley, homes were turned into forts and meeting houses, fortified, as places to gather for safety. Resistant and remarkable Presbyterian clergymen suddenly emerged with a military spirit. Men like the Reverend Samuel Davies and the Reverend John Brown exhorted their people, don't run, fight, fortify. And it worked. The forts sprang up, built of stone, mostly of logs, and their families could gather when danger was inherent. Some of the meeting houses that met that need are today called Presbyterian churches. Augusta Stone, Oxford, Timber Ridge, and Providence. They learned how to prevail, those families, and they helped shape the course of American history. From 1755 to 1765, they stood up to every threat from the French and the Indians, and they survived. Their self-reliance hardened into iron confidence. They knew they could take care of themselves. They would not be intimidated. No one, including their own king, would be allowed to take away their liberty. And a decade later, those Valley Presbyterians helped Thomas Jefferson write a fiery document that resulted in war with the mother country. We call that sheet of parchment the Declaration of Independence. Our founding fathers were in the minority. 2/3 of the American population opposed that declaration and war. They wanted England's protection. They respected royal rulers. They did not respect frontier rabble. After years of struggle, the minority was victorious. A new nation was born, offering liberty and justice for all. And Benjamin Franklin summed up our emerging philosophy in one famous slogan: those who would purchase security at the price of liberty deserve neither. There is your history lesson for today.